Stark, and Joseph N. Cooper. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. Thank you for keeping your phones on silent during the event. There'll be time for a Q&A, so get your questions ready. If you haven't yet picked up your pre-ordered book, or if you'd like to buy a book, you can do so at the register, right over there in the corner with the yellow sign, after the event. Thank you for buying books with us and supporting both our store and these amazing authors so we can continue to make really cool events like this one possible. This event is being live streamed. Hello, YouTube. So if you don't want to be recorded, just avoid this general area for the duration of the event. We'll shut it off during the signing lines, and then you can move around freely and not worry about that. Now, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's guests. Joseph N. Cooper is the inaugural Dr. J. Keith Motley Endowed Chair of Sport Leadership and Administration at UMass Boston. His research agenda focuses on the intersection between sport, race, gender, education, and culture, with an emphasis on sport involvement as a catalyst for holistic development and positive social change. Doug Stark is a museum professional who has worked in sports museums, including the Tennis Hall of Fame, USGA Museum, and Basketball Hall of Fame. His career has focused on making history more engaging, relevant, and accessible to a diverse audience. He has written about basketball history. We are here tonight, of course, to celebrate race and resistance in Boston, a contested sports history. Boston is a city known for its sports, as well as its troubled racial conflicts. But generations of Black athletes, teams, sports writers, and front office executives have exercised historic influence in Boston over the years as they advocated for racial integration and transformed their sports into modes of racial pride, resistance, and cultural expression. Race and resistance in Boston goes beyond the familiar topics associated with the city's premier professional teams to recount the long history of Black sporting culture in the city. This collection takes a close look at Black Bostonians' involvement in sports as varied as soccer, cricket, boxing, baseball, golf, tennis, basketball, and hockey, and illuminates the effect of Boston's desegregation and busing crisis on scholastic athletes in the 1970s and 80s. With personal reminiscences, and as well as, getting really dehydrated here, as well as research from scholars of sport, race and resistance in Boston captures the intersection of Black history and sporting culture in America's city on a hill. Please welcome Doug Stark and Joseph N. Cooper.
Thank you, Myra. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. And thanks, Joseph, for joining us. So unfortunately, my co-editor and colleague on this project, Bob Savornik, couldn't be here this evening. But what I thought we'd do is I would provide some background on this project. It's sort of been a multi-year, multi-volume project about race and sports. And then I was going to hand it over to Joseph for a bit. He wrote one of the essays in the book entitled Black Activism in Boston Sports, and it's part of the first section, which is Framing Race, Community, and Resistance in Boston. And in many ways, his essay sets the table for the rest of the book, and then I would come back to talk about some of the other essays or topics, and we could have a conversation, open it up for questions, so pretty loose here. So when Bob and I started this a number of years ago, there was this traditional narrative about race and sports. You have on one side the Boston Celtics with Bill Russell. They were the first to draft a Black player in Chuck Cooper, Bill Russell, and the team was very progressive during the 60s. He was the first Black head coach in the NBA. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have the Boston Red Sox, who in 1959 became the last team to integrate with Pudsey Green. And that's the prevailing narrative that sort of dominates the conversation. And so what Bob and I were looking to do is to understand that a little bit more and also to offer a counter-narrative. So this is a multi-volume project, and there's currently 2 volumes. This is one, and the other is Boston's Black Athletes, which is sort of biographical essays. And we have 2 other volumes that are in various stages of development. And the focus is really on one city, Boston. And that's what makes an edited volume about race and sports unique, is that it's about one city, and obviously Boston has had its troubled past that most people are aware of. So just a few sort of basic facts about the project. The time frame we cover is from 1850s to the present. So it's 175 years of black athletes, black sports in Boston. Second, men, women, amateur, high school, college, professional, and international are all covered to some degree. And as Myra mentioned in her introduction, we have a broad range of sports that we cover. There's rowing, pedestrianism, physical education, basketball, hockey, football, baseball, cycling, lacrosse, intercollegiate sports. There's wrestling, cricket, boxing, rodeo, soccer, golf, tennis, track and field, bowling, media, stadiums, front office personnel, the impact of busing, and commemoration. So we've done our best to be as comprehensive as we can. I would also say it's a multidisciplinary approach. So essays have been written from the perspective of historians, sports sociologists, media studies, and gender studies. Some contributors like Joseph are local, they're based in Massachusetts, but the vast majority are national, and most of the essays are offering new scholarship. So there's very few reprints or anything of that nature. And as I mentioned, we sort of focus on a particular city, Boston, and there's not a book like this that's focusing on another city in America. So Bill Russell once referred to Boston as a flea market for racism. And I'm sure a few years ago you might remember Baltimore Orioles center fielder Adam Jones was the subject of racism while playing at Fenway. So there's this perception that Boston's a very difficult place for black athletes to succeed. But our goal is not to answer the question of whether Boston is more racist than other cities when it comes to sports. Nor is the purpose to focus on historical firsts. Rather, we're trying to give a much more comprehensive understanding of race in sports and to uncover untold stories. These stories have resided in Boston's black community. So we're not discovering them, we're just helping to tell them or to bring them to light. And what we argue is black Bostonians have shaped sports, and sports has shaped Boston's black community. And these stories have resided for more than 100 plus years in their community, and they're still stories today. So with those sort of opening remarks, just to sort of set the table, I wanted to turn it over to Joseph, but before I do, when we started this project, Bob and I reached out to as many scholars, historians, and academics across a broad range of disciplines. And Bob connected with Joseph and explained our intent with this project. And from the beginning, Joseph was very enthusiastic. And I think he started writing his essay before we even had a book deal. So he very much appreciated that. And I should also mention that Joseph has a new book out. It's called Black Sporting Resistance, Diaspora, Transnationalism, and Internationalism. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joseph to sort of talk about his contribution and how he sees black sports and activism in Boston.
Thank you, Doug. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I won't use the mic. I'm a professor, so I'm used to speaking in front of large crowds, although the students that I interact with normally have their cell phones out, and I'm trying to keep them entertained from social media, but I appreciate you all being attentive and not having the devices out. As Doug mentioned, my name's Joseph Cooper. I'm not a native of Massachusetts, as you probably can tell from my accent. I'm originally from Greensboro, North Carolina. I did my undergraduate and master's work at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and then my doctoral work at the University of Georgia And I started my faculty career at the University of Connecticut, UConn. Met my wife there, so we were in Connecticut for a few years, and now we call Boston home. So we both work at UMass Boston. As Doug mentioned, my background is sports sociology, but I cite and I engage with a number of historians, journalists, a lot of us who are passionate about the serious study of sport. We overlap and cite each other. So when Doug and Bob reached out, I said, well, I've been reading your work anyway. I'd be happy to be a contributor to your text. As Doug mentioned, I've written 3 solo books myself, edited several books, and I know how much effort and time it takes to get chapter contributors. So when they asked me, I said, hey, I will make sure I deliver. I won't be one of those contributors that you'll have to keep emailing, hey, send me your chapter. The publisher is knocking on our door. I'll give you a little context about my kind of framework for the chapter, and then I'll give you some specific examples from the chapter. So my chapter is on Black activism in sport. So about 2016, right after Colin Kaepernick took his knee, the NFL, I had some PhD students who I was working with at the time, and one of them came to me and said, Dr. Cooper, Colin Kaepernick is like Muhammad Ali. And I'm a little bit older than my doc student. I was like, oh, that's a bit of a stretch, but we had a very intellectual, stimulating conversation about, well, what are the similarities and differences between different types of activism? So within the text, I incorporate what I call a resistance typology and a sport activism typology. So if I were to say activism, most of you, first thing that would come to mind is protest, right? Somebody doing a gesture, raising a fist, taking a knee. You would think about organized marches. But with our typology, we said, well, there's multiple types of activism that sports persons, not just athletes, people connected to sport, journalists, coaches, managers, other spectators have utilized to advance social justice causes, whether it's along the line of social class, gender, ability, race, etc. So within the typology, we have categories including symbolic activism, scholarly activism, grassroots activism, mass mobilization activism, media activism, legal activism, political and civic activism, as well as we've added the category of fashion activism, which I'll talk about Kitty Knox, who was a cyclist here in the greater Boston area in the late 1800s. And so with these different types of activism, we wanted to explore how do sports persons utilize their platform in and through sport to ignite positive change. So if you think about activism in sport, as Doug mentioned, when you think about Bill Russell becoming the first African-American head coach in professional men's basketball, that was breaking a barrier within the context of basketball, right? Did not totally dismantle racism in the broader society, but it made a change within that space. What Bill Russell also did was utilize his platform through basketball to participate in the 1963 Human Rights March here in Roxbury, right? This idea of human rights are not limited to participating in sport. The other typology that I incorporated in the text was the resistance typology. So all of us embody resistance in various ways. And so at the basic level, we all have agency, right? So we utilize our agency and our personal dispositions to choose to be passive or actively against certain social realities or certain conditions. I tell my students all the time, one definition of privilege is the luxury of not having to think about or adversely be impacted by a set of social conditions, right? So the idea of resistance is that if you have the agency, even in a privileged position, to say, hey, there's some injustice happening, it might not directly impact me, but I could utilize my platform, my resources to engage and contribute to change. So agency is the base level. The next level of resistance that we talk about is pioneering, right? So once it becomes possible, the cliche is if I can see it, I can be it. So we look at a number of areas in sport where there's significant underrepresentation across certain identity backgrounds. primarily that's due to the prevailing stereotypes that have gone back centuries about people's innate abilities. So we talk about pioneering. We also talk about advocacy, a concept we call hybrid resistance, which means the ability to engage in multiple types of resistance across time, space, and context. And then we talk about activism, social movements, and revolutions. So as it relates to Boston, I'm going to highlight a few examples that I talk about in the book. Many of you know about the Boston Red Sox, but you might not be familiar with the Boston Resolutes. The Boston Resolutes were an all-black baseball team that was established in the late 1860s, right? And this was a group of individuals who had been emancipated, right? Who had been freed from slavery and said, hey, since we are not being allowed to participate, we're going to create our own amateur team and we're going to build out our own baseball leagues. So prior to the Negro leagues being established in the early and mid 20th century, there were local all-colored leagues that were established here in the greater Boston area. And the Boston Resolutes were a part of that. They had teams in the greater Boston. You talk about Malden, Everett, Chelsea, several areas. So within that context, I highlight grassroots activism being manifested in the form of a local amateur baseball team. There's a woman named Kitty Knox who was a cyclist. She was a woman of biracial background, and she wanted to participate in cycling. Many of you know about KB Switzer, right? The first woman to run in the Boston Marathon, and the only reason she was allowed is because she signed her name KB, right? And there's a famous image of the tour, the Boston Marathon, the person who was overseeing the marathon trying to pull her off of the course, and luckily she had several allies who assisted her. Well, about 60 to 70 years prior, Kitty Knox broke the barrier in cycling. She was a colored woman at that time, and in 1893, she became a part of the Riverside Cycling Club, and then she was the first African American to be allowed into the League of American Wheelmen, which was, prior to that point, an all-white cycling. Now, we know that with all forms of activism and resistance, there's always a backlash. So 1 year later, the LAW, the League of American Wheelmen, created a policy that banned colored people from being a part of that. That did not stop her. She continued to run in races. She would write articles in the Boston, well, at the time it wasn't the Boston Globe, but Boston newspapers, to draw attention to the fact that not only was she as a colored person being discriminated against, but also women who were seeking to have access. So many of you know that the women were not allowed to run in the marathon in the Olympics until 1984, right? Even though the modern day Olympics were established in 1896. So Kitty Knox is someone that we should always lift up as somebody who is a native of the greater Boston area, who used her platform through cycling to advocate for change. So I highlight numerous examples of individuals that existed in what I call not just the Reconstruction era, but it was considered the new Negro era. So these were African Americans who were growing up in the post-Emancipation Proclamation era, right? And they were creating their own sporting spaces to advocate for change. And then when you fast forward to the 1940s, in the 1950s and 60s, as Doug mentioned, the Boston Celtics were definitely trailblazers by drafting Chuck Cooper in 1950 to be a part of the Boston Celtics. Many of you may know the name Willie O'Ree, the first he was Canadian descent, who broke the barrier in hockey for the Boston Bruins. Right, so you had this in the background that was taking place, and this is all happening right on the cusp of the anti-busing crisis that took place here in the greater Boston area. So you had professional sport leagues that are wrestling with this idea of how do we integrate without creating too much turbulence among our fan bases, but then we also want to make sure that we're providing equitable opportunities. Another individual that I highlight, many of you may know Doc Counts, famous sport journalist, and one of the big areas of sport that African Americans were fighting for, not only in Boston but across the country, was this idea of legitimacy. So the perception of inferiority was used to justify the enslavement of Africans, but later on, it was to justify a lack of access to equitable opportunities. So it's like, okay, it first started as you cannot play the game because you're innately inferior. So then it goes to, well, not only can you not play the game, you cannot be in a leadership position, and you certainly can't cover the game in the form of sport media. So you have people like Doc Counts who said, hey, I'm gonna start to create encyclopedias, archives, documenting the great accomplishments of African-American baseball players to help hopefully lead to what would eventually happen with Jackie Robinson and breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball, and subsequently having more opportunities in sport. So that was taking place during the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, and the Black Feminist Movement during that era. And then at the conclusion of the chapter, I talk more about, in more recent times, other local individuals. Some of you may know Charlie Titus. He's the founder of the UMass Boston Athletics Department. He retired after 42 years. He was also a coach there, but he was very much involved in providing opportunities for youth. Some of you may know the name Tony Richardson. In 1991, he founded a nonprofit organization called No Books, No Ball, which was designed to provide educational and athletic opportunities for youth, not only in the Cambridge area, but the greater Boston area. And then Alfreda Harris, who was the longtime director of the Shelbourne Community Center, which also served as a platform to provide opportunities for youth to engage in healthy physical activity. So as Doug mentioned, a part of the project was to expand our conception of sport on multiple levels, but two pronounced levels that I want to leave you with my closing remarks. Sport has an impact on society beyond the professional level. So when you think about Boston sports, everyone can say Celtics, Patriots, Red Sox, right, Bruins, those are the first ones that come to mind. But I hope after reading our text, you start to think about youth sports, interscholastic sports, intercollegiate sports. You start to think about the different ways in which organized competitive sports, but also informal recreational sports, served as critical breakthroughs for our collective society. And the last contribution of the text is that we hope that you begin to think of sport beyond the athletes themselves. Obviously, the athletes play an integral part in the broader ecosystem of sport, but we want you to think about sports persons. People like Doc Counts, who was a sport journalist and an archivist. You want to think about Kitty Knox and the people that she was connected with who weren't involved in sport, who also advocated for social change in and through sport. So that's a brief summary of my chapter, and I look forward to the Q&A.
So, a lot of what Joseph mentioned are sort of, essays or articles in this book, and, maybe we'll tackle baseball for a minute. So after the Resolutes in the 1870s, there was a team called the Boston Tigers, and then the Colored Giants. So from the 20s into the 40s, black baseball had a very strong presence. They just never had a team in the Negro Leagues. And Doc Counts, along with another journalist, Sheep Jackson, were really instrumental. Now, Doc Counts was from Medford, one of the early African-American communities in Massachusetts. He was sort of a sickly child, couldn't really play sports, but he liked to write and he liked to research. So he wrote for the Boston Press, the Guardian in town, and he kept his day job, which was with the Postal Service, and this was sort of a hobby. And in 1934, he became the first black media member to get a credential with the Boston Red Sox. And he tried for years, for decades, early before a lot of the others, to try to integrate the sport. And he went to the owners of the Red Sox and the Boston Braves when it was a two-team city. And the owner of the Braves said, I understand, I'll try to help, but I really can't get it past anybody here. And the Red Sox sort of went nowhere. People might remember there was this 1945 tryout. There were 3 black players, one including Jackie Robinson. They went to Fenway, they had a tryout, and they never heard again. And then a year later, he was with the Montreal Royals, and then eventually the Dodgers. But Doc Counts did a lot of writing. And if you look through the black press, there's a lot of articles about some of these players. After they died, he had such long write-ups of these players, and they were such key figures in this period from the 20s to the 40s in black baseball. So there is an essay about Doc in here by somebody who focuses on the media, and that's quite interesting. You also mentioned Kitty Knox. There's also Major Taylor. Some of you might have heard about Major Taylor. So he was from Indianapolis, but he lived most of his life in Worcester. There is a Major Taylor Museum in Worcester, and he was, most people think Jack Johnson, the boxer, was the first great African-American sporting champion, but Major Taylor won the 1-mile sprint event at the 1899 World Track Championship and became the first African-American to receive the level of cycling world champion. So that's another from that time period, which would be interesting. There's an essay about cricket, and most people wouldn't think about cricket. And this is probably one of the more fascinating stories because for years, the black players in Boston by the 1920s were the best cricketers in the state, and they were West Indian. By the 1940s, though, the second and third generation were less interested. Baseball and basketball took their interest, but cricket was interesting. I should also mention that there's some intersection and overlap with Rhode Island and Boston, particularly Providence on Pawtucket. And in the 1880s, professional soccer in Pawtucket integrated with two brothers, Fred and Oliver Watson. So there's stories about early soccer, the integration of soccer. You have cricket, and you have baseball, and that really forms the early part of the book, which we're calling, I think, legitimacy in the Jim Crow era. And then there's obviously the third section is power and performance in the freedom movement, and we talk about Bill Russell, we talk about Willie O'Ree, we talk about Allison Feaster, who played women's basketball at Harvard and is now a VP with the Celtics. There's also an essay on sort of intersectionality and gender studies, and we talk about Jason Collins when he was with the Celtics, and he sort of came out at that time. The Celtics also had an assistant coach in Kara Lawson, who's now the coach at Duke women's basketball. So there's a lot of these sort of stories that form a much more comprehensive understanding of race, sports, Black Boston, the city of Boston. And so, you know, obviously as we talk about, there's a lot here that's sort of been untold, but has resided in the black community.
One point that Doug mentioned that I want to also emphasize, that, and I'm sure all of you think about this within your own identities, is that we use the term black community or black communities, but one thing that we talk about in the text is that there's a lot of heterogeneity within the black community. So for example, Doug mentioned with cricket, the West Indian influence, and a number of the Caribbean islands that were represented. With the Boston Resolutes, they had members of the team who were African American, those who were from Cape Verde. Many of you know the Cape Verdean population is very prominent here in Boston, as well as in Taunton and in the greater Boston area. And then they also had Afro-Cubans. So when you think about the sport of baseball, baseball was very integral, and even if you look at modern day Major League Baseball, you have Dominicans represented, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Panamanians, a number across not only Latin America, but Central and South America as well. So the idea of looking at black communities across the African diaspora is something that's also valuable within the text. So it gets you to look deeper, particularly with African Americans, who are the largest population within the United States. But even prior to immigration laws being passed in the mid 20th century, there were a number of African diasporic people who were migrating to Boston for the same reasons that several groups immigrate to Boston, right? For better opportunity, for economic livelihood, As I mentioned, in my home state of North Carolina, which is a former Confederate state, I know there were several during the Great Migration, African Americans who were migrating to Massachusetts. As we know in the book, that racism was prominent then and is still here now. But comparatively to a lot of other regions of the country, this was much more of a safe haven, relatively speaking, and provided more opportunities. So there was a lot of coordination throughout the Northeast region within Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, et cetera, as it relates to building barnstorming teams where they were traveling and competing. And I also want to mention that a lot of the baseball teams participated in interracial competitions. So well before the major leagues were doing it, at the amateur and semi-professional level, this goes to show the power of local relationships, where before it happens on the national and international stage, it often happens in communities where people live next door to each other, where they go to the same school, where they go to a restaurant, where they share business interests, and they realize, like, hey, you're human just like I'm human, right? You enjoy playing sports just like I enjoy playing sports. So we'd like to believe that also we highlight how at the local level barriers were broken down, which eventually led to the professional level following suit.
And Joseph mentioned Cape Verde, and there's some of you might remember a Boston College player later with the Celtics, Dana Barros. So he's Cape Verdean. He's still in the area. He has his own basketball, I guess, club.
Yep, Stoughton.
Stoughton, yeah. So he's still around. So the book ends with sort of an essay about commemoration, and the notion is, has Boston done enough to commemorate its black athletes? So in the City Hall Plaza, there's the Bill Russell statue. There's a basketball court named after Medina Dixon, who was a high school basketball player. There are some things. There's a statue of Louisa Stokes in Malden. She was a track and field in 1932-36 Olympics and went over and couldn't compete. But generally speaking, there's a lot of, let's say, statues and buildings that have been, or streets that have been named. But when it comes to Boston's black athletes, they haven't quite had the same exposure in terms of being commemorated and remembered as well today. Maybe before we open it up, do you have a sense of maybe further directions, areas that you think are still worth exploring, or things on the youth sport level that you mentioned?
Absolutely. So some of you may be familiar with the STEC Center, which is the Sporting Tennis Enrichment Center here in Boston. And it's a youth organization. It provides opportunities for individuals across all ages, but they have a plethora of youth programs. So one of the areas that I think could be explored, I mentioned Alfreda Harris with the Shelbourne Community Center, is looking at youth sports not only in Boston, in neighborhoods like Roxbury, Dorchester, but also the greater Boston area, and really saying, like, who were the trailblazers? Who did break down the doors? I highlighted in my chapter Mike Jarvis, former head coach at Cambridge Latin, and now very much well known. Obviously, people remember Patrick Ewing and all the different championships that they won. But thinking about that area, Doug mentioned Allison Feaster at Harvard. I think there's quite a bit of history at all of our universities and colleges in the greater Boston area around barriers, right? Not only the Ivy League schools, not only the Division I institutions, but even Division II and Division III, like at UMass Boston, right? And really looking at those histories, herstories, and queerstories as well. I think it's also important we talk about the prominent sports of baseball, basketball, football, but there are a number of other sports around cycling, right? Field hockey, lacrosse, swimming, a lot of the country club sports that we don't know a lot about, black achievements and contributions in those areas as well. So as much as we can go deeper in the most popular sports, I think it's important to expand that area as well. And then just as it relates to my recent book, the Black Sporting Resistance book, I think it would really be interesting to see the international connections that Boston sports persons have established across borders. So using terms like diaspora, transnationalism, and internationalism, what are ways in which not only competing in the Olympics, many of you know next year the Men's World Cup will be here in North America. There will be some games at Gillette Stadium. There's a lot of history there around mega events, including the Boston Marathon, and barriers that have been broken as it relates to Boston and Greater Boston Black sports persons. So those are some areas that I'd like to see. Obviously, we mentioned Doc Counts. Many of you know Howard Bryant, famous journalist who's sold a lot of books as well. Looking at his history, right? I don't believe he's written an autobiography or memoir yet, and it'd be interesting to hear about his journey and the ways in which he's broken barriers in the field of sport journalism as well. So, and even with the Boston Globe, looking at different contributors throughout the years who are of African descent and how they've contributed and utilized sport to advocate for broader social change.
So one of Howard Bryant's earlier books is called Shut Out, History of Race in Baseball in the town. And he does talk about Counts, and he talks about Larry Whiteside, who was a columnist and reporter. From Bob and myself's perspective, we're working on 2 more volumes. We have enough essays and topics. I think our challenge is always finding more contributors. I think one of our bigger challenges in this project is finding enough contributors that are willing to do this, since a lot of it requires original research, new scholarship, and also there's not, other than the Bay State banner, it's been a while since there's been a black press in Boston, and not all of it, it's on microfilm, but it's not digitized, so it's become a little bit of a challenge. And I'll just say, Joseph mentioned country club sports, so there's a good story about golf, which is being worked on. So in Stowe, Massachusetts, there's currently the Stowe Golf Club. It's used to be called the Mapledale Country Club. So in 1916, the Professional Golfers Association established, which was the all-white, the PGA umbrella for golf. And about a decade later, a gentleman, Robert Hawkins, who was a black businessman and a golfer, worked his way up as a caddy at various clubs. He bought Mapledale Country Club, and from what we can tell, became the first black-owned and operated golf club in the United States. And he was one of a couple people to help found the United Golfers Association, the UGA, which was the the other PGA, sort of became the other entity for black golfers. And they established the Negro National Open Championship, which was a tournament every year for black golfers. So the first 3 years of the club, 1926, 27, 28, the Mapledale Country Club hosted the first Negro National Open Championships, which had the best golfers, which were really at that time from the Midwest and the South and a little bit in the Northeast. The Depression sort of led to the closure of the club. Hawkins went on to do some other things. In 1941, and then once in the 70s, the UGA came back with their tournament here in the Boston area. So that's like an area that could be explored, sort of golf, and golf is still played. Black golf has a big presence in Franklin Park and has for decades, and that's another story that can be told. So I think with that, maybe open up to questions. Have at it.
Well, excuse me, thank you all for your work. It's just fascinating. Of course, I want to hear about the Celtics and Red Sox. But what you really made me think is about other sports. And I just want to share something in my work in the future. Boston Ski Park. And it's an organization for youth to teach kids from black communities, vulnerable communities here in Boston, how to ski. and with the goal to create the first black ski champion, Olympia. It was founded by a black man, went to Harvard in the early 60s. He went skiing with his buddies up in one of the mountains, and they wouldn't let him ski. And he says, I've been to the mountaintop, and they wouldn't let me ski. But anyway, it just sort of shows how rich, you know, this is an apocryphal thing that I was familiar with, but it really speaks to the point y'all are making, that how extensive this is and how rich these stories are.
Thank you, this was very interesting. His name escapes me, but there was a football player on BC from Brockton.
Lou Montgomery.
Yeah, does he get any shout outs?
So he is so Lou is in here in this book. And, you know, intercollegiate sports that Joseph mentioned toward the end. So we talk about Lou Montgomery, and there's, that was in 1937 and 1941. There was also a Boston University football player, Charles Thomas, which Bob's working on an article about him. Chester Pierce was a football player in the 40s at Harvard. So,
Was he the psychiatrist?
yes, the psychiatrist, yes. That's correct. He became a world-renowned psychiatrist. That's correct. We also have a lacrosse story from World War II from Harvard, Lucien Allen. And Boston University's hockey team, men's hockey team in the 60s, was very much ahead of the curve in integrating. So we have future stories on those. We have not found much on women intercollegiate sports at this point. So if anybody knows of anything, that would be helpful, but we haven't. But yes, and there's a desire to get a Lou Montgomery statue as well out there as well. So that's in the news.
A lot of rich athletic history in Brockton. Boxing, football. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot. And I know you mentioned the Celtics. You know, I think we mentioned, at least I mentioned in my chapter, 1965, they were the first NBA team to have all five black starting five. You know, Sat Sanders, Sam Jones, Casey Jones, Bill Russell, and I'm escaping the fifth one.
Willie Knowles.
Willie Knowles, that's correct. Yeah, it was the starting five, so they broke the barrier there as well. So there's a lot of rich history there, but you know, I think not only in my chapter, but several other chapters, you know, the contested nature of that, right? So Bill Russell, you know, won 11 NBA championships here, broke the barrier and head coach, but you know, had his home broken into and vandalized, and feces were, you know, left on his bed, and he was, you know, the target of a lot of vitriol, you know, primarily because of his race. To a lesser extent because he was also a confident, outspoken black man during the time that, you know, many people forget. He was right behind Muhammad Ali at the famous Ali Summit when Ali declined to go into the Vietnam War and said, you know, I stand behind Muhammad Ali's decision, you know. Yep, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar as well, Jim Brown, you know, there were others. So there's a lot of rich history there around, and I think being able to deal with those contradictions, I think that's important, right? That we highlight the pathways that have been created in Boston and in Massachusetts, but we also highlight, you know, the contested nature, and we still have a long way to go. A lot of the neighborhoods in this area are still very much racially segregated. A lot of the sporting opportunities are not equitable with the Boston public schools and the zip codes compared to the suburban areas. So that's another area, not only kind of connecting the history of the city, but also with contemporary times, where a lot of things are changing, big things in sport now, data analytics, looking at how data is informing artificial intelligence, is becoming in esports. I mean, there are a number of kind of emerging areas that, you know, historians 50, 60 years from now will be looking at this time period to see, you know, what did Boston do and what are the leaders. And that's why each of you play a role too, whether you're a former athlete or coach or not. Any way that you're connected to sport, you know, how you are by purchasing the book. That's showing some support and showing legitimacy by some of the individuals that we highlighted, telling a friend, a family member, and encouraging others to highlight their existence. Because, you know, as Doug alluded to, and Bob as well, and that's why I'm such a big fan of their work, is if you don't document the history, it can be erased. And when it's erased, there's this idea that you did not exist and it did not happen. There's a larger conversation in our country right now of that happening in other areas, but in sport, it's been a prominent issue. And I mean, even as Doug mentioned, there's a Black Baseball Hall of Fame in Kansas City, and but we don't have anything exactly like that here in Boston. We should, right? We should, you know, have that where you're highlighting the individuals that are highlighted in this text and in the previous volume about their meaningful contributions, because by bringing those stories to the forefront, it begins to show why denying people opportunities is not based on biological determinism, right? It's not that people are innately inferior. That's not the problem here. The problem is that there are policies that are grounded in racist and sexist, classist and ableist beliefs that are preventing people from having the opportunity, and the resilience that so many people still show even when they've been denied, you know, creating their own leagues and finding ways to break barriers and writing stories, filing lawsuits, and showing that, hey, you know, we are human too, right? And we deserve opportunities to play sports and to enjoy it just like any other group.
So two quick things. Going back to Brockton, I think that's where they want to put the Lou Montgomery statue. And last summer, they also introduced a Marvin Hagler statue. And then the woman who wrote the foreword, or the early essay, Shantae Bonds, she plays for the Boston Renegades, which is the women's professional football league that's mainly a summer league. She's from Brockton, so there's a Brockton. And going back to Kitty Knox, she's from the West End. And the West End Museum, which is right near the TD Garden, gives tours of the area, and they include Kitty's neighborhood and where she lived and that sort of thing, if you're interested in a little bit of that. So, any other questions, comments?
I don't know if I need to. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My main question is more around the ownership and then the community around it. You mentioned that the community, they were worried about the spectators not supporting the leagues if they were to include African Americans in their league. Would you say it was more the ownership, or was it really truly the communities that supported it? Because yes, it's important to have the revenue around the communities, but frankly, in my opinion, it would be the owners that made the final call.
So I'd say a little bit of both, right? I think there were certain neighborhoods, as I mentioned, there were several interracial contests, and particularly when the Negro Leagues were first established, some of the interracial contests generated large gate receipts, right? Now, the reasons why people came to the games were mixed, right? So you had some who were coming to say, see, we told you that this group is superior to that group, or to, you know, hurl racial insults in that regard. I give an example of how many people are familiar with the Harlem Globetrotters, and how it became more kind of a comical thing. So some would come to the games thinking that the black baseball teams were inferior, and so this was just a spectacle. Whereas for the black baseball players, like, no, we know how to play. We're here to prove our worth. For many of those owners, I know many people have seen the documented history of Branch Rickey and kind of the idea that it wasn't all altruistic as to why he wanted Jackie Robinson. There are clear economic motives, so you did have some owners that were saying, hey, if it's going to generate gate receipts, I don't care who's playing on the field. But you did have others who, you know, were very much like, no, I'm against it. You know, I'm blanking on her name here, but the former owner of the Cincinnati Reds, Marshott, was, you know, caught, you know, and then Al Campinas also had racist remarks back then that said, like, hey, you know, I'm not going to change my beliefs for anybody, right? So a lot of it too, back to the residential segregation, is that when you have people who don't live next to each other, primarily their ideas of quote unquote the other are based on stereotypes or whatever's being portrayed in the mass media. So you had some of these communities that you didn't have any black person living anywhere near where these communities are. So to introduce an interracial competition is like, no, by no means. I mean, once again, the anti-busing crisis in the 1970s. I mean, it was like, oh, you're not gonna have those children come to school with my children, right? I mean, throwing rocks. I mean, it was mayhem, you know? And so those individuals, like, they lived in these same neighborhoods, right? So it's not like this is another part of Boston, and like they lived there. And I mean, many descendants are still here now, right? And harbor those views, unfortunately. So I think it's a little bit the owners, but I think a lot of it is if the will of the collective people is strong enough, it will make the owners say, hey, we got to do something different. But sometimes those gatekeepers can play an influential role, because keep in mind, Doug mentioned this, many of these owners were business people who were also connected to politicians and other individuals who had influence in terms of resource allocation, et cetera. So a lot of that has to do with the relationships that are in place. So if it's like, hey, maybe I'm okay with it, but my business partner and that politician isn't, we're not gonna have it. So it's not always an individual choice. People make decisions based on their business interests. And so, yeah, so that was definitely a part of it.
Question?
I vaguely recall Mel King talking about the influence of football
Yes.
In college down south, and was wondering if you if there's an angle of looking at activists who had sports backgrounds that they didn't become famous for their sports, but that the sports influenced them.
I've written extensively about Paul Robeson, who's not a Boston native of New Jersey, and obviously was a standout football player at Rutgers University, earned his law degree, but later went on and had a prominent career in the arts. So that's an individual who I highlight a lot in my work about how he had a illustrious athletic career, but his most prominent activism took place after he left sport. So most people don't even remember that he was a talented athlete, and many people don't remember Jackie Robinson engaged in quite a bit of activism after he stopped playing baseball as well. So there are a lot of sports persons who, even after the bright lights of their playing days or coaching days, engaged in social change, and in some cases they were able to be more effective when they were out of the limelight. You know, a lot of our colleagues talk about the restrictions that you're placed on when you're in the sporting spotlight. You know, Colin Kaepernick being an example of that, right? That, you know, you do overstep a boundary that the powers that be, the owners, don't want. Now you're not going to have that platform. But even Colin Kaepernick, he's published several books. He started a Know Your Rights campaign, grassroots activism, civic engagement. So he's continued to do work. He's really been critical of the prison industrial complex, and really promoting abolition through his work. So he doesn't have the same spotlight as he has. So to your point around Mel King, there are a number of former athletes and former sports persons who continue to engage in change well after their playing days are over.
So one of the Mel King stories is he was very good friends with Ray Flynn, the former mayor. And they used to play a lot of basketball, semi-pro basketball. And Ray Flynn's still alive, he's about 85 years old. And one of the topics, you know, today with Bill Russell and the Celtics, I mean, basketball is such a huge fan. But if you look at the first half of the 20th century, basketball is sort of this non-existent sport. In 1902 in Lowell, you have a gentleman, Bucky Lou, who's 18 years old, and he's the first professional black basketball player in 1902. He was a player, he was a coach, an owner, a promoter, and a manager. So there's a similar baseball figure about a decade later, Come Posey out of Pittsburgh. But really, Bucky Lou had this huge career for about 25 years, integrating and playing integrated teams, being a coach, black coach at UMass Lowell before, of all-white teams and integrated teams. And then you don't have a professional basketball player until Chuck Cooper signed, drafted in 1950. So in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, there are these fraternal organization teams, community teams, both men and women. It just hasn't been documented well enough, but it's in the black press. There's this huge gap of basketball. But then you get into the 60s, and you start to see, Ray Flynn, Mel King, and some of those. There was a place called the Norfolk House, which was a place for games and community, and a number of the Celtics players, like Sat Sanders, played there as well. So that basketball is really undeveloped in terms of learning. And Mel King's obviously part of the story. Oh.
Have you come across anything on Boston reaction to Jesse Owens? I believe he got a ticket grade in New York, but I don't know if he made appearances in Boston.
I haven't seen anything specifically. I would not be surprised in
Be
Boston.
interesting.
Yeah, but I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, after 1936, when he won the 4 Olympic gold medals in Berlin, Germany, at the height of Adolf Hitler promoting Nazism, it sent shockwaves, through the United States and internationally as well. Many people feel like that was very instrumental, kind of in the nascent civil rights movement, that particular achievement. But yeah, I mean, even with Jesse Owens, I know some of you have seen the major film, he experienced a lot of challenges later in his career, and that's unfortunately Paul Robeson as well. A lot of these prominent black athletes in their latter years, experience tremendous mental health decline. Economic opportunities for them are oftentimes pulled away when physically they're no longer able to kind of perform at the level that they were. There are outliers like Muhammad Ali, who still was able to generate income for himself until his passing. But so I'm not as familiar with anything specific to this area and the reaction, but clearly.
Well, but staying on the track and field theme for a minute, there was Louise Stokes, who I mentioned. So in 1932, 1936 Olympics, her and the other black female teammate, they made the Olympic squad. They went to LA, they went to Berlin. They were not allowed to race. But she was one of the top track and field sprinters of her era. And then she only was a track and field athlete for 11 years. But then she got involved in the Colored Women's Bowling League. And she was very instrumental for decades with bowling. And we've got an upcoming piece on sort of black bowling in Boston and her contribution. But that's another, she's known for this. There's a statue of her at Malden High School. But she devoted 3 times as much of her life to bowling, which is sort of forgotten about.
There's time.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. First, that's more of a Duke blue for UNC grad.
We call it Beacon Blue.
Yeah.
At UMass.
So before you mentioned, I have a lot of before you mentioned the UNC part, I have a lot of family in Chapel Hill.
Oh, yeah.
And just quite frankly, growing up here, living here,
Yeah.
one of the things I notice whenever I visit Chapel Hill
Yeah.
is just the diversity. You go to the grocery store, you go to the kids, my nephew and my cousin's kids' schools,
Yeah.
and it's like, oh yeah, this is different. This is different than Boston, and it's noticeable right away.
Yeah.
And it's it always catches my eye.
Yeah.
But I guess my question, and you did answer, I think, some piece that come to mind. It could be laws, it's deep racist policies, and I guess my question ultimately is, where do you think other cities, maybe more at least northeast, cities that might be considered similar-ish to Boston, so not someplace totally different, what do you think they do better than Boston that they don't have this racist reputation, or maybe as bad of a racist reputation? I know it's a deep question. There's a lot of layers. I mean, not a lot of different answers to that. But you always hear about that with Boston.
Mm-hmm.
You don't hear about it as much, I feel like, with other cities. Can you think of things that they do better? Even in other streets, statues, policies. Anything else come to mind that just a way to not have as much of the reputation of Boston? What can we do better? What do they do better? What have they done better?
Yeah, I mean,
Thanks.
For me, like when you think of like New York and Chicago, right? A part of it to me, it does come down to a numbers thing, right? So when there is a critical mass, so when you have places like Brooklyn, and once again, these areas are not utopias by any stretch of the imagination, but what you had was a large number of African diasporic peoples. So just by the critical mass, it was able to shift. And there was also efforts outside of sport where cross-racial relationships were being built. So when you think about somewhere like Harlem, New York, right, and you had the Cotton Club, so you had musicians, and during the Harlem Renaissance, that, you know, you had artists and intellectuals. So to me, it's an ecosystem thing, right? So when you think of Boston, think about sport is a part of the Boston ecosystem. So whatever you're seeing in sport, the good, the bad, the ugly, you have to extract that to what about outside of it, right? What about in the schools? What about in healthcare? What about in business? What about in the courtroom? What about, so to me, the areas that are doing better, usually there's cross-racial collaborations across the ecosystem. And oftentimes sport isn't at the forefront of it. Sport, in some cases, is a benefactor of barriers being broken beyond that. So for me, it's a numbers, critical mass. Residential is a big part of it, right? You know, homeowners associations, gentrification, redlining, you know, pricing people out, like, and so that's a piece of it. A lot of it too is city planning. So you talk about skiing, and you talk about, you know, ice hockey rinks and access to, you know, you go in certain communities, you can't even find a decent baseball field, let alone facility. So to me, it takes visionary leadership at the city planning and the political level. So what Boston can learn from others is how do we break barriers and build relationships beyond sport, and then use sport as a conduit for greater change as well. How do you make Boston more welcoming to diverse cultures, right? You know, in certain areas of the city, you could see a number of restaurants from various ethnic and cultural backgrounds. Then you go to other parts of the cities, you got to go several blocks to see that. So for me, it's a number of things, and you're asking a very important question, because like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? I think you start where you can start. If you are in your local community, ask questions about who's represented and who's not represented. Are there ways in which we can build partnerships across diverse communities? In your schools, ask questions about, well, on this team, we haven't had a person from an underrepresented background. Have we thought about ways to change that, right? We haven't had a coach or an athletic director in that regard. So I think some of these communities, I also think sometimes it's geographically based. So when you think about California, you think about certain areas of Florida like Miami, just by virtue of where they're located in proximity to other areas, countries. Once again, that leads to that critical mass taking place. So that would be my response.
I would also say for decades, Boston had a very small black population. Very small.
Yeah.
So, Myra,
Thank you.
I'm so sorry, I do have a question. So recently we've seen a lot of discourse in American politics surrounding transgender athletes in sports, transgender and non-binary athletes. And some of this discourse is starting to create barriers, not just for trans and non-binary people, but also women of color, specifically Black women. I guess I'm curious, based on your understanding of this history, where do you see some of this discourse leading to progress, and where does that progress begin? Like in communities and like youth sports, collegiate sports, because we're seeing some of these bans, and I'm just curious about like your thoughts on where some of this is going.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think the forecast is grim right now. My colleague, Leticia Ingracio Cardoso Brown, just published a book called Say Her Name. I believe it's called Black Women, Black Feminism in Sport. And she talks about Caster Semenya, who is not transgender, who identifies as a cisgender woman, but has been under extreme scrutiny by the International Olympic Committee based on her build and her testosterone levels. I think, as an academic, I think there just needs to be more education. A lot of the underlying logic behind banning transgender is a sexist logic, right? That men are better at sports than women. You can't have men coming over, taking over women's sports. The reality is within sex groups, there's variation in testosterone levels, et cetera. Like Michael Phelps, for example, who's a cisgender man, his lung capacity, they did studies, is almost 1 times more than the elite swimmers that he's competing against. Should he not be able to compete against other men? Shaquille O'Neal is a very large human being, right? Should he not be? So to me, I think it's demystifying the idea that somebody who identifies as transgender is innately better at the sport just because of their previous sex or the gender that they identified with, which I don't believe is true. So for me, it's just, there's no data that shows that there is a competitive advantage. There's ideologies that are taking over policy. So even if you listen to a lot of the congressional hearings, a lot of the examples that they give, even Leah Thomas, the transgender athlete who won, if you look at Leah's performances across, Leah didn't win every time, right? So it's like one time, right? Which we would hope. At the same time, with the issue as it relates to women and girls sports, I identify as a cisgender man. So I don't, as much as I think the data should lead the conversation, I also want to respect the perspectives of the participants who are most directly impacted. Similarly, like as a black person, when there are groups of people who aren't black who are leading the conversation, I feel that that's inappropriate, that, hey, let black people speak for themselves as it relates to that. So I think as more education comes out, it's going to take a while. A lot of people don't even know what transgender means, right? So if you ask them LGBTQ plus, define what each of the, like a lot of people don't know. And typically fear arises, anxiety arises when people are unsure of something and they're afraid. So I think just having more conversations, educating people, hopefully there's equitable opportunities, because I think transgender athletes deserve opportunities like everyone else, right? I don't think it should be a separate category. That's just my personal opinion. But I think you should do research and figure out, if there's a competitive advantage, to what extent is that different from a competitive advantage. Like I was at UConn, University of Connecticut, the women's basketball team has won 11 national championships, right? All of the women on the team, as far as I know, are cisgender women. Should they no longer be allowed to compete? I mean, the idea of competitive parity being the reason why you're denying, not to mention, to me, the logic that somebody would go through the extent of the process to go through the transgender journey to only, that's just, that to me doesn't pass the smell test. So, but once again, I understand women who are cisgender who say, we fought so hard for rights for people who were born with the biological makeup of ourselves, we don't think it's fair. I think that's a discussion that has to happen, because I have a lot of feminist colleagues who are on very different ends of that discussion. So I just think more education would be helpful.
All right, let's give Doug and Joseph a big round of applause. And now, the moment that you've all been waiting for, the signing line. As a reminder, if you have a pre-order book, or if you want to buy a book, which you all should by this point, you can do that at the register right over there. Otherwise, we will start the signing line on the right side of the table, kind of try to snake around towards the cards.